February 1989 might be the single most brutal month for box office disasters in modern Hollywood history. 12 films released across 4 weeks, and their combined domestic gross barely cleared $65 million. I've got Tom Selleck here. I've got John Candy. I've got a pre-Oscar Denzel Washington vehicle that opened in just 234 theaters. And there's one movie that bombed so badly, a Dublin theater manager shut down the entire building to save on heating because nobody was showing up. All of this happened while Rain Man dominated every single weekend. Let's break it down. Carl Reiner saw Robert Lindsay on Broadway in Me and My Girl and decided this guy needed to be a movie star. Bert Rigby, You're a Fool, was the result. Reiner wrote the screenplay specifically as a star vehicle after Lindsay won the 1987 Tony Award for Best Actor in a Musical, beating out the guy from Les Miserables. Warner Brothers gave Reiner around $15 million to make a loving tribute to classic Hollywood musicals, complete with Lindsay performing impressions of Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly, and Buster Keaton. Here's the thing though, Lindsay was a sensation on the West End and Broadway, but American moviegoers had absolutely no idea who he was. Warner Brothers clearly figured this out before release because they dumped Bert Rigby into exactly 23 theaters. It never expanded beyond that. It made $40,498 on opening weekend. The final total was $75,868. That's a 99.5% loss on production cost alone. You'd think a musical tribute starring a Tony winner would at least find an audience, but nobody came. Roger Ebert gave it 2 out of 4 stars and wrote that when Bert sings Singin' in the Rain, it just made him want to watch Singin' in the Rain instead. The R rating for profanity cut off the family audience most likely to enjoy it. Anne Bancroft received a Razzie nomination for Worst Supporting Actress. And get this, when it played at Dublin's Adelphi Cinema, fewer than 20 people showed up over 4 days, so the manager withdrew the film and let the theater go dark to save on heating. Lindsay later said he was shattered. His self-esteem had completely gone. He was thinking of giving the whole thing up. His Hollywood career was over before it started. He never got another American lead. Speaking of movies nobody saw, Paperhouse had a secret weapon that should have guaranteed at least some attention. Bernard Rose directed this British dark fantasy with an early Hans Zimmer score, the same Hans Zimmer who was simultaneously scoring Rain Man and about to become Hollywood's hottest composer. The film follows a feverish girl whose drawings create a dream world based on Catherine Storr's 1958 novel Marianne Dreams. Paperhouse was distributed by Vestron Pictures, but here's where it gets interesting. Vestron was financially collapsing. They'd built their company on home video, rode high after Dirty Dancing made $214 million from a $5 million budget, then overexpanded catastrophically. By 1989, their financing was falling apart. Security Pacific National Bank would eventually pull their credit line entirely. They couldn't properly distribute anything. The result? Paperhouse played on single-digit screens. No tracked domestic gross exists in major databases. It was essentially invisible theatrically. Roger Ebert gave it a perfect 4 out of 4 stars, calling it a film where every image has been distilled to the point of almost frightening simplicity. He compared it to Bergman. It holds 100% on Rotten Tomatoes today. Vestron would be bought out and file for bankruptcy by 1992. They were actually set to release Pretty Woman before going under. Rose recovered and went on to direct Candyman. Zimmer became Zimmer, but Paperhouse just vanished into the void. It's now streaming free on Tubi as a cult classic, a masterpiece that played to empty theaters. George Harrison's Handmade Films produced Powwow Highway, and Harrison reportedly called it his favorite production from the company. This Native American road movie cost $3 million and featured early appearances by Graham Greene, Wes Studi, and John Trudell before any of them became famous. The score featured Robbie Robertson, with songs including Sweet Fire of Love by Robertson and U2. Principal photography took place in Sheridan, Wyoming, with 10 days filmed at the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. Warner Brothers handled distribution for Handmade Films. They deemed Powwow Highway too small for a Los Angeles release and opened it in Seattle with essentially zero marketing. It made $283,747 total. That's it. You'd think a film this poorly released must have been terrible. But it won the Filmmakers Trophy at Sundance. It won Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Actor at the American Indian Film Festival. It received 3 Independent Spirit Award nominations. Gary Farmer's lead performance was so impressive that Jim Jarmusch watched it and wrote the role of Nobody in Dead Man specifically for him. Handmade Films was already spiraling after the Shanghai surprise disaster with Madonna and Sean Penn. Harrison would later sue his partner for fraud and win $11 million in damages. The company dissolved in 2018, but Powwow Highway got vindication. In December 2024, the Library of Congress selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry. 35 years too late, but they finally recognized what audiences never got to see. Mike Leigh hadn't released a theatrical film in 17 years when High Hopes arrived. He'd been making television work for the BBC, developing his signature improvisational process where no script exists when seeking financing. Channel 4 eventually backed this Thatcher-era class satire about a Marxist motorcycle courier navigating family dysfunction across Britain's rigid social strata. It won the Fipressi Critics' Prize at Venice and 3 European Film Awards, including Best Actress for Ruth Sheen. Scorus Pictures distributed it in the U.S. tiny art house outfit. No stars, no marketing budget. It played on a maximum of 25 screens. Roger Ebert gave High Hopes 4 out of 4 stars, calling it an alive and challenging film that throws our own assumptions back at us. Metacritic has it at 84. Rotten Tomatoes shows 92%, and almost nobody in America saw it. UK gross was around £245,000. US gross wasn't even tracked by major databases. Leigh would go on to make Naked, Secrets and Lies, which won the Palme d'Or, and Vera Drake. Cast member Leslie Manville later earned an Oscar nomination for Phantom Thread. This was the beginning of one of cinema's most important careers, and it happened in front of empty seats. Cannon Films was dying, and American Ninja 3 Blood Hunt proved it. The franchise had already dropped 62% from the first film to the second. Original star Michael Dudikoff refused to return for the third installment because he objected to filming in apartheid South Africa. He was firmly against the movement and government in that country. Kurt McKinney was offered the role next and also declined. David Bradley stepped in as replacement. More convincing martial artist, less charisma, Cannon gave them a low budget and hoped for the best. The film was shot in South Africa despite the controversy and featured the standard Cannon formula of cheap action and minimal plot. Opening weekend was $222,252 in 140 theaters. Total domestic gross was $902,152. That's a 91% decline from the original American Ninja. The franchise was dead. No Rotten Tomatoes score exists because critics simply ignored it. IMDb users rate it 3.8 out of 10. Steve James remained the only bright spot. Fans argued he should have been promoted to lead. He'd been a Cannon Films mainstay throughout the decade, appearing in The Exterminator, all 3 American Ninja films, The Delta Force, and I'm Gonna Get You Sucka. He passed away in 1993 at 41 from pancreatic cancer. He'd been cast as Jax in the Mortal Kombat film. Lloyd Kaufman and Trauma Entertainment filmed so much footage for their Toxic Avenger sequel that they split it into 2 separate movies. The Toxic Avenger Part 2 was the first half of that mess, partly filmed in Tokyo, Japan, an experience that inspired Kaufman to later conceive Sergeant Kabukiman NYPD. Budget was $2.3 million. The original had made over $15 million through all channels despite minimal theatrical release. This sequel opened in just 15 theaters to $28,950. Total domestic was $792,966. And it earned something rare, a perfect 0 on Rotten Tomatoes. One of the few films to achieve that distinction. Critic Luke Y. Thompson wrote that everything is still in place, but nothing quite works. The production was chaotic. Original Toxie actor John Altamura was fired after threatening staff members. Ron Fazio took over when production moved to Tokyo. Both actors appear in the finished film. Michael Jai White made his uncredited debut as an Apocalypse Inc. executive before anyone knew who he was. Manga legend Go Nagai had a cameo. Part 3 came out later in 1989 and made even less, $363,561. But somehow, this franchise survived. Toxic Crusaders cartoon in 1991, toys, comics, an off-Broadway musical, and a 2025 reboot with Peter Dinklage and Kevin Bacon that scored 87% on Rotten Tomatoes. The franchise's best critical reception ever came 36 years after this bomb. Charles Bronson made 9 films with director J. Lee Thompson over 13 years, starting with St. Ives in 1976. Kinjite Forbidden Subjects was the last one. It was also Bronson's final film for Cannon Films, the studio that had defined his late career with the Death Wish sequels and various action cheapies. Budget was around $5 million. It opened in 320 theaters to just over $1 million. Total domestic was $3,416,846. Rotten Tomatoes shows 0%. The Washington Post called it the worst Charles Bronson film ever, and that's saying something. Roger Ebert gave it 1 out of 4 stars and delivered a devastating observation. He called it Cannon's best-made film, but also their most distasteful. The film dealt with the exploitation of minors in ways critics found problematic, walking a line between condemning and indulging. It featured an early appearance by Danny Trejo before his breakthrough. Bronson went on hiatus after this to care for his wife Jill Ireland, who was battling cancer. She passed in 1990. Thompson never directed another film. Cannon Films officially ceased operations in 1993. This was one of the last gasps of both the partnership and the studio. Gregory Hines wanted to capture the legends of tap dancing on film before they were gone. Tap brought together Sammy Davis Jr. and a collection of veteran tap masters, including Harold Nicholas, Sandman Sims, Bunny Briggs, and Jimmy Slide for what would become Davis's final film appearance. He'd be gone 15 months later from throat cancer. Hines visited Davis during his final illness when Davis could no longer speak. Director Nick Castle wrote the screenplay because the art form was personal to him. His father, Nick Castle Sr., was a legendary Hollywood choreographer who worked with Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly, choreographing the iconic ceiling dance in Royal Wedding. The younger Castle is also known for something else entirely. He played Michael Myers in the original Halloween for $25 a day. TriStar originally planned a fall 1988 release, but pushed Tap to February when the cut needed polish. It opened to $2,217,150. Total domestic was $9,114,702. Rotten Tomatoes shows 56%. Roger Ebert gave it 3 out of 4 stars and praised Davis for finally having a juicy role where he isn't just playing himself. The film featured a 15-year-old Savion Glover. Hines would later call him possibly the best tap dancer that ever lived. The challenge scene captured living legends performing together one final time. Several of those dancers passed away in the years following. Hines himself died in 2003. I was honestly rooting for this one. It's now an invaluable historical document that just happened to bomb. Denzel Washington had just earned an Oscar nomination for Cry Freedom, but there were persistent doubts about whether he could become a major movie star. For Queen and Country, his first true starring vehicle, had attracted little audience. The Mighty Quinn was supposed to answer that question. MGM/UA opened it in just 234 theaters. Hampton Fancher wrote the screenplay based on A.H.Z. Carr's 1971 novel, Finding Mobby. That's the same guy who wrote Blade Runner. Film rights cost $75,000. They shot on location in Port Antonio, Jamaica, with Bob Marley's daughters Cedella and Sharon appearing in the film. Rita Marley served as reggae music consultant and had a cameo as a wedding singer. Opening weekend was $1,429,306 in those 234 theaters. Total domestic was $4,557,214. Rotten Tomatoes shows 89%. Both Siskel and Ebert gave it 2 thumbs way up. Roger Ebert gave The Mighty Quinn 4 out of 4 stars and put it on his year-end top 10 list for 1989. He wrote that Washington creates a movie star overnight in this role, calling out his reserves of charm and offbeat humor. Vincent Canby said Washington could be the first black matinee idol since Sidney Poitier. MGM/UA was languishing at the time and couldn't be bothered to give it proper distribution. 10 months later, Glory won Washington the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. Bob Dylan later wrote in his autobiography that Denzel was exactly how he imagined the character when he wrote Quinn the Eskimo. The movie that proved Denzel was a star played on 234 screens while Rain Man dominated everything. James Woods and Robert Downey Jr. delivered the best reviewed film of the entire month. True Believer holds 96% on Rotten Tomatoes from 23 reviews. The Rotten Tomatoes consensus calls it a compelling mystery with powerful performances from a pair of well-matched leads, and it vanished in 3 weeks. Columbia Pictures released it. The screenplay by Wesley Strick was loosely based on the case of Chol Soo Lee, a Korean-American wrongly convicted of a 1973 San Francisco Chinatown slaying. Woods' character was based on Bay Area defense attorney Tony Serra. Woods was coming off Salvador, Bestseller, Cop, and The Boost. Critically revered, but never a reliable box office draw. Downey was 23 years old and had broken through with less than zero, but he was already dealing with personal struggles. Opening weekend was $3,009,692 at number 9. Total domestic was $8,742,750. 3 weeks and done. It won the grand prize at the Cognac Festival du Film Policier and received an Edgar Award nomination. Downey said of Woods that he's the greatest actor in the world and he was just sucking up as much as he could. The film inspired a TV series called Eddie Dodd that lasted 6 episodes. But Woods and young Downey simply couldn't open a picture in February 1989. Downey's real breakthrough would come with Chaplin. His ultimate resurrection wouldn't arrive until Iron Man nearly 2 decades later. John Candy executive produced Who's Harry Crumb himself. This was a significant personal project. Director Paul Flaherty was a writer on SCTV, the Canadian sketch show where Candy became a star. Flaherty's brother Joe, also an SCTV cast member, has a small role in the film. John Hughes suggested the casting of Jeffrey Jones after directing him in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Jim Belushi appears in an inexplicable, uncredited cameo sitting on a bus reading a newspaper. Candy proposed giant billboard advertisements. TriStar rejected them. He watched their lackluster campaign and it only rubbed salt in the wound. He later took public shots at TriStar for their non-campaign of Who's Harry Crumb, calling them a real team for ya. Opening weekend was $3.9 million at number 5 in 1,197 theaters. Total domestic was around 10 to 11 million. Ranking 84th among 1989 releases. CinemaScore gave it a C, which is basically a failing grade from audiences. Rotten Tomatoes shows 33%. Janet Maslin dismissed it as a weak comedy, unfavorably comparing it to The Naked Gun. Critics blamed the script while praising Candy's effort. One review noted the opening was bright enough to make you hope Candy might finally have his first good role since Splash. But no, this came between The Great Outdoors and Uncle Buck. Uncle Buck finally proved he could carry a film 6 months later with 79 million domestic. Candy died in 1994 at 43. He deserved better studio support than he got. Tom Selleck was supposed to be Indiana Jones. Steven Spielberg told him he got the part, but CBS wouldn't release him from his Magnum contract. Harrison Ford became the second choice. Ford is very grateful for Tom. After Magnum ended in 1988, her Alibi was supposed to establish Selleck as a solo movie star. Warner Brothers gave him around $15 million. Director Bruce Beresford would win Best Picture that same year for Driving Miss Daisy. Cinematographer Freddie Francis, art director Henry Bumstead, and composer Georges Delerue all worked on this film. Selleck had just come off 3 Men and a Baby, the biggest film of 1987 at 167 million domestic and the first Disney production to cross 100 million. Opening weekend was $5,037,047 in 1,429 theaters. Total domestic was $18,699,037. Rotten Tomatoes shows 17%. Metacritic has it at 24 out of 100. Roger Ebert gave her Alibi half a star. He wrote that you know a movie is in trouble when you start looking at your watch, and you know it's in bad trouble when you start shaking your watch because you think it might have stopped. He also noted a continuity error where a house is blown up mid-film, but reappears intact in the finale. Paulina Poriskova received a Razzie nomination. Here's the thing though, Selleck and Poriskova allegedly developed such a difficult working relationship that by the end of filming, they refused to be in the same room. The promotional poster was created by photographing them separately and digitally combining the images to make it look like Selleck had his arms around her. Selleck never became a solo movie star. Television proved his medium. Blue Bloods ran 14 seasons. February 1989 exposed something fundamental about Hollywood. 3 studios were collapsing in real time: Cannon Films, Vestron Pictures, and Handmade Films all released bombs this month, while their companies crumbled. The most critically acclaimed film earned 96% on Rotten Tomatoes and disappeared in 3 weeks. The Denzel Washington vehicle that Roger Ebert put on his top 10 list opened in just 234 theaters. Quality didn't matter. Star power didn't matter. Even winning at Sundance didn't matter. February 1989 proved Hollywood's biggest enemy isn't bad movies. It's studios that don't believe in what they've made.